Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of instructive videos to help you play chess better. In today's video, we're going to do another amateur game. We're kind of rotating what we like to do. We do openings, we do end games, we do master games, amateur games, thought process, time management, you name it. If it's important, we're going to do it. So today is an amateur game someone sent to me. If you do have a game to send to me, the best way to do it is to just copy and paste it into an email, go to my website danheisman.com, and just send me the moves. Don't send me an attachment with a PGN or anything like that. You could do that, but it's just as easy to just send me the text of the moves. Okay, so let's take a look at today's game. This game was played on Lichess, I think, Li Chess, and it was a 30-0 game. Now, what I tell my students is, if you're going to play that kind of faster time limit, you want to play with an increment or a time delay, because you can easily get into what I call race conditions. A race condition is where there's no increment or time delay, and late in the game you reach a position where neither side could possibly checkmate the other before somebody's flag falls, in which case you get these crazy games where it doesn't matter what move you make, it just matters who moves the fastest. And of course the FIDE and the US Chess Federation, they all realized that this was not a right way to play chess. So once they made sudden death time limits legal in the late 70s, they quickly suggested using time delays and increments to avoid these kind of race conditions. Now, a lot of the online servers have buttons or tournaments where you have to play like 30-0, 30 minutes with no increment. And of course, it's better to play in a tournament than not at all, but I wish they would actually create buttons that were like 35 instead of 30-0. Because getting people into these race conditions is not very conducive to normal play, because if you go to the US Open or the US Amateur, or you play in a FIDE tournament or whatever, you're never going to see these serious games that are played for titles are never played with these 0-second increments or time delays. So, forcing people to play with them is okay, it's just for fun, but it's much better practice to play a 35 game or a 30-10 game than it is to play a 30-0 game. All right, well, I'm going to get off my soapbox and show you the game. E4, black plays E5, white plays bishop C4, bishop's opening. All right, so black plays knight F6, that's the #1 move. And now, of course, we don't know whether white didn't know the opening or whether he played a gambit on purpose. But the main moves here would be something like D3, to guard the pawn, and then black would play something like C6, threatening to play D5. But instead, white plays a kind of gambit move, knight to F3. I don't know if he feels he's counterattacking the e-pawn or what. So black plays knight takes E4. And now white's got a little bit of a problem. If white plays knight takes E5, as was done in the game, black can simply play D5 and stop the attack on F7 while doing an AWL, which I had a video on earlier, attack it with something worth less, to attack the bishop and gain time. On the other hand, if white plays queen to E2 to skewer the knight and the pawn, black can still play D5, guarding the knight and attacking the bishop, and again, black's retaining some advantage here. So the #1 move here by the computer, the only move the computer says to give white equality, or at least close to it, is knight to C3, which is kind of a gambit line now. Black's going to take the knight, white's going to take back this way, and we get kind of an interesting position where the famous defense F6 is possible, even though that looks disastrous. Anyway, we're not getting into opening theory here, but black takes the pawn, knight takes E4, white plays knight takes E5, and black's only move, but it's a good one, is to play D5. So as I said, that blocks the attack on F7 and hits the bishop at the same time. And now white's got to be a little careful. Stockfish 10 says that maybe white's best move is to counterattack the knight with D3. White has to be very careful here. There's a lot of bad things that can happen if he doesn't play the next couple moves carefully. His other good move is to play bishop E2. What he plays is bishop to D3. And of course, the bishop on D3 is blocking the pawn on D2 so that the bishop on C1 can't quickly develop. And this gives black some marvelous opportunities to start doing some tactics. And black does. He plays one of his two best moves. His two best moves are to play queen e7 to threaten the knight, and then if the knight moves, he gets a discovered attack winning the queen, like the famous queen e7, knight f3, knight c3 check, hitting the queen. And if the queen goes to e2, you can just take the queen with the knight. If he gets out of check any other way, you just take the queen. So he can't move the knight. This is really bad for white, obviously. Black plays a move that's just about as good. He plays queen g5, counterattacking the knight and the pawn on g2. There's no moves that really save both. For instance, suppose white plays knight to g4. Well, the knight's attacked twice. It's only guarded once. Black could take the knight either way and be winning. The computer says much better to attack the queen. If he plays f3, you can play check. If he plays g3, you can play knight takes g3 and sneaky pin. All kinds of bad things are happening here. Computer says in this position, black's up by 22 pawns. All right, so let's get back to the game. So, of course, white cannot play anything that saves both. The best move, according to Stockfish, is queen e2, and if queen takes e5, and white plays f3 to pin the knight to the queen, the computer suggests black should just play f5. If f takes e4, then f takes e4, and this bishop is kind of trapped. For instance, bishop c6 check, b5 check, c6. If bishop to a4, black has all kinds of good things here, like bishop c5, threatening to stop white from castling and to threaten castle kingside and come down to f2. And this bishop is worthless and white's position is toast. All right, so things are pretty bad here for white. So white plays knight to f3, and of course black plays queen takes g2, threatening the rook and threatening queen takes f2 mate. So white is forced to play rook to f1. All right, so when you got your opponent on a run like this, you want to develop your pieces as fast as you can, and if you can develop them with threats, so much the better. So here black has two most obvious moves. He could either play bishop to g4, hitting the knight a second time, or bishop to c5, hitting this pawn a third time. It turns out that if you play bishop c5 and white plays queen e2, now this knight can't be guarded. Now you could play something like bishop to g4, or if you're worried about bishop takes e4 followed by check, which really doesn't help white that much, you could just castle here. And this game is pretty over here. The problem with doing it in the reverse move order, where you play bishop g4 first, is when white plays the forced bishop e2 to guard the knight, that frees up the d pawn so that bishop c5 no longer works. And of course, when you're in these kind of positions, you want to look at all the permutations, but you're only playing a 30-minute game. So in a 30-minute game, you've got to be very careful about using your time. And here, black unfortunately chooses the wrong sequence, and he plays bishop g4 first, and white, of course, plays bishop e2, the only move to save the pinned knight. And now black may as well just play bishop to d6 and castle. That's his best idea. Instead, he makes what I would call an AWL error. He plays bishop c5. Well, that's developing with a threat. The problem is that white's only move to stop the threat is going to win a tempo. So this gives white a free move to play d4 to stop the threat and hit the bishop. You would never want to do that. If you're playing black here and you see bishop c5 and you say to yourself, all right, I'm threatening that pawn 3 times. I'm threatening bishop takes f2 check, rook takes f2 is the only legal move, and then queen takes f2 is mate. You wouldn't just stop at that point and say, well, that looks good. It develops my bishop with a threat. That's kind of playing, hand-waving chess, or at least at the best hope chess. What you want to do is you want to say, what's white going to do? Well, what white's going to do is he's going to play d4. And if he's going to play d4, why would you play bishop c5? So basically what black's doing here is he's giving white an entire tempo to help develop his army, because up to now, white's been all tied up into little pieces. And the computer says the difference between bishop d6, which is about minus 2.5 pawns, and bishop c5, which is about minus 1.7, 1.8, is about a half a pawn. So the tempo here for white is worth about a half a pawn. So I call this an AWL error. You know, when you put out a piece and your opponent can make a move that attacks it with a lesser piece, and that enables you to have to move the piece again. Now, you know, a lot of people quote me this kind of non-existent principle, which is don't move out your queen too early. Well, we could say the word too about anything. Don't castle too early, don't breathe too much, don't push too many pawns, you know, don't leave too many of your pieces undeveloped, you know, don't take too much time. Well, anything that's two is bad, but that doesn't help you because you don't know when two is. So unfortunately, these two principles, the ones that have the word TOO in them, don't mean very much from an English standpoint. So the better principle is don't put your pieces where lesser pieces can attack them if in doing so the lesser piece does something constructive and the piece that has to move is less constructive. Well, that's exactly what's happening here. And when white plays d4, he has to move out his d pawn at some point, or his b pawn, to get his bishop out anyway. This gives him more center control, and this bishop really doesn't want to move again. So this is an AWL error, where you're just letting your opponent get time on you. The good news for black is he's still in good shape. So he plays bishop to d6. And now white needs to get his pieces out. So the computer says, excuse me, that white should play a move like bishop e3. Makes sense? White plays knight to e5. Well, that does hit the bishop 3 times. The problem is that white's underdeveloped, and black can easily meet this threat, and it doesn't really help white develop. So that's probably not his best move. And black decides he has to trade something here. So he decides to take off the knight on e5. And now white has a choice of taking the bishop on g4 or taking the bishop on e5. He chooses the better of the two. He takes the bishop on e5, and now he's threatening bishop takes g4. Black needs to stop that. The computer suggests the best thing to do is just play bishop takes, queen takes. And now you could, because of the threats to maybe queen b5 check, you could castle. Or you could even get greedy and play queen h2, not because you want to win the pawn, but because you want to threaten the pawn on e5 with some pressure on the e-file, since white's not castled and black can castle anytime. All right, so back to the game. So black plays bishop to h3, which kind of pins down the bishop on e2 to guarding the pawn, so he can't play something like bishop f3 because of queen takes f1 check. All right, so here white could, if he wants, take the pawn on d5 with some complications. And white's losing, so complications are good for the players losing. When you're winning, you want to keep it simple. So white plays knight on 1 to d2. Computer says his best move was f3, but his second best move was actually queen takes d5. So he plays knight d2, developing his piece. And the engine suggests queen g6 is the best defense. Black simply develops the other knight, and now the engine thinks white should play knight f3, where black's better by about 1.3 pawns. Instead, white plays knight takes e4. Black takes with the pawn, and white plays queen d5 with the idea of threatening the b7 pawn. But here, black doesn't care that much about the b7 pawn. You know, he should just castle one side or the other. And white's king's still stuck in the middle. For instance, he could castle queenside and guard the b7 pawn, and now he's threatening to move the knight. Instead, black plays rook to d8, keeping the king in the center, which is, you know, probably not the best way to play it. All right, so what should white do? Well, white still needs to get his pieces out and castle, but he's also got to watch out for discovered threats here with the knight. And white decides he can put up with those discoveries, so he plays bishop e3, and the computer says that's okay. And now what should black do? Well, none of the discoveries for black are all that wonderful. He's not going to win any material. So again, he could just castle. But the best move, according to Stockfish, is to play knight b6, hit the queen. If the queen takes on b7, just don't worry about your queenside pawns. Just castle. And the fact that the rook is stopping the king from getting out of the middle is going to cause major problems very quickly. For instance, black's going to be able to move the queen, and the bishop's going to hit the rook, and there's going to be all kinds of problems. But black needs to get his king out of there as fast as he can. Instead, black falls to a temptation that a lot of lower players do, which is they like to make the trickiest move possible. Well, the idea that usually they're working on is, if I play the trickiest move possible, it shows everybody how smart I am. And the faster I do it, the smarter I am. So the smarter, the trickier the move and the faster you play it, the smarter you are. Is that good logic? And the answer is no, that's terrible logic. Why when you go to a tournament are the last people done the grandmasters and the masters and the experts? Because they're being extremely careful. They're not trying to show everyone how fast they can move and how smart they can be. They're trying to be as careful as possible because that makes them the best player. So what's the most tricky move that black could play here? Well, the most tricky move is to move the knight, but to move it somewhere where white could normally take it by a pawn, but he can't. So black plays knight to f6. And the computer says this is such a bad move that black, who's been winning the whole game here, at this point, before his move, was up 3.1 pawns in evaluation by Stockfish 10. And after this tricky but terrible move, the computer says, white, instead of black being up 3.1 pawns, now white's up 4.2 pawns. So it's a 7.3 pawn blunder. Why? Because after white moves, black's knight is going to be attacked, and he's not going to have time to castle, and the queen and the bishops are going to come down and start attacking the black king if he doesn't want to lose the knight. And that extra tempo that's going to keep his king in the middle is going to cost him the game. So white plays queen b5 check. Even better is to just play queen takes b7, threatening to take the knight. And if the knight goes, let's say, back to d7 again, just castle queen side. And if black tries to castle king side, you can pin the queen to the g7 square with a big king side attack, and the computer said white's completely winning this position. So that would be white's best move. Instead, white plays queen to b5 check, and black should take his lumps now and just admit his mistake and bring his knight back to d7. But it's hard for people to do that. So he plays c6, counterattacking the queen, and says, Mr. Queen, you can't take my knight because I'm attacking your queen. But all this does is really force white to take a pawn and now threaten to take this pawn with check, and he's threatening to take the knight. Well, how can black stop that? Well, again, he has to play knight to d7. It's his only move because every other move is met by queen takes c6 check, and then black's position is going to collapse. But instead, black still refuses to go back to where he came from. You know, good players don't worry about where they came from. They try to find the best move and they play it. If it means admitting they make a mistake and going back where they came from, well, then they do it. I see a tendency of weaker players to say, my knight came from d7, I can't move him back to d7. That would be a admission of defeat. So here, black plays the terrible move, knight to d5, and now white's lead has grown to 7.7 pawns. Actually up to 8 pawns now. So black plays the obvious queen takes c6 check. And of course, if black puts the bishop in the way, he just loses the knight. But he has nothing better, really. He desperately tries to save the situation with rook up. And now white has two really good checks that he could play. They're both going to clear out this line for the bishop to go to b5. So Stockfish says queen c8 check is the best move, and says that after queen c8 check, king e7, bishop c5 check, the bishops are coming in the game, king e6, queen takes h8, and thanks for the rook and your king's in trouble, plus 12 for white. So instead, white plays queen a8 check, and black plays rook d8 and says, you want to draw now? Maybe you can just keep repeating the position. White says, no, I think I'll get another piece in the attack. Bishop to b5 check. And now, of course, if bishop d7, again, queen takes d5, wins the knight. So black reluctantly plays king to e7. But that lets the other bishop get into the attack. So now we're going to have two bishops and a queen attacking the king. So white correctly plays, or plays bishop c5 check. The computer actually says queen b7 check is a little more accurate, but we can't really argue with bishop. I might play bishop c5 check myself. Although one thing I would do before bishop c5 check is I would try to figure out what my next couple moves were. I don't think white's doing that. I think he's just making moves and seeing what will happen. And we can see that from how the game's going to progress here. So bishop c5 check, and black plays his only move that he could really play, king e6. And now white's queen is attacked on a8, and he would like to move it with tempo. So the question is, where should he go? Well, the engine says you don't need to move it with tempo. Take this pawn, not because we want to win a pawn, just because we want to save our queen and cut off the king in the middle of the board. And after queen takes a7, it says white's up by about 5 pawns, maybe slightly less. Instead, white plays queen c6 check, which still leaves him winning, of course. And black plays the only move he really can, which is king takes e5. All right, so now white has to look at all his checks, captures, and threats and decide what he wants to do. Well, what are the candidate moves? Well, he could play f4 check. That looks a little bit dubious because black has en passants and stuff. He could sacrifice with bishop to d4 check, and it would be nice if king takes d4 allows queen c3 mate, but unfortunately queen c3 is not mate because the knight's guarding it on d5. Oh well, good idea, Dan, but it didn't quite work. He could play bishop d4 check, bishop d6 check, then rook takes d6. We don't see any great checks with the queen. e8 is covered, d6 is covered, e6 is covered, f6 is covered, d5 is covered, c7 is covered. He could just get another piece in the attack and get his king into safety. So what he could do here is just castle queenside. You don't have to win the game in one move. Black's king is in super danger. White's got the advantage of the bishop pair. He's got 2 bishops versus a bishop and a knight. So just castling queenside here is reasonable. Stockfish has been thinking while I've been talking. It says f4 check is the best move. It's complicated, but it's the best move according to Stockfish, who can look through all the lines. It actually likes rook d1 a little better than castle queenside. Let's see what it says about castle queenside. Castle queenside, it says black should play queen g5 check, white should play king b1, and then bishop takes f1, winning the exchange. And it says white's still winning easily here with like f4 check, e takes f3, rook takes f1, queen d2, bishop d3. Not easy to find these moves. And white's ahead by more than 2 pawns. Not easy to see. So I can understand why he doesn't want to give him the check on the castle so he can take the bishop. That's why Stockfish would rather just play rook to d1, so black doesn't get that check in. All right, so when you're in this kind of position, you know, if you have time, and we have no idea how much time, this was not a timestamp game, we just know it's a 30-0 game, it's very possible in this position white has 2 seconds left, and he's got to move immediately. We don't know. Or he could have 29 minutes and 42 seconds left. One of the things I tell my students is when you're showing me a game, if you could timestamp the game, like if it was played online, if you could preserve the timestamping, or if it was played over the board, write down how many minutes you have left after each move. So we can kind of discuss the time issue of whether you played too slow or too fast, or you played a critical move too fast, or you played a non-critical move too slow. These are all very important issues when you're trying to figure things out. And here I have no timestamping information. But what I do know is that white now made a terrible move, and he must have made a board vision error here. Either that or he's in terrible time trouble, one of the two. And I hate to end a game like this because it was a very instructive game up to now. And then when I make a move like this, everybody goes, oh, why should I watch a video with a move like this? These guys must be beginners. But actually, the ratings of the 2 people on Lichess, according to the email, one player was rated in the 1800s and the other player was rated in the 1600s. I believe white was the one in the 1800s. And the guy in the 1800s now plays a move that's not quite 1800-like. He plays queen checks, which would be a wonderful move if it weren't for the fact that black can get out of check by taking off his queen, which obviously white didn't see, or he wouldn't have played it. And when people make those moves, you know, they always say to me, I don't want to show you this game. I just put my queen on pre. I didn't see the knight. And then I say to them, well, okay, but let's talk about why you put your queen on pre. What caused you not to see the knight? Like maybe white had lots of time here and he played this move way too fast because he thought he was winning easily because he got overconfident. Well, that's a kind of mistake that we can learn from, is overconfidence when you're winning. Or maybe he only had 2 seconds left here because he played the start of the game so slowly that he only had 2 seconds left and his flag was about to fall and he just reached out and made the first move he could, in which case we can talk about not getting yourself into such severe time trouble, especially in these zero increment games. So whatever it is that causes you to miss a move like this, it's very important. A lot of my students don't want to look at games where they make these gross blunders. But of course, removing the gross blunders from your game gives you a lot more bang for the buck than removing your subtle blunders. You want to find out why you make gross blunders and try to eliminate them first. If I have to give you 10 lessons on getting rid of gross blunders, you're going to gain a lot more playing strength than you would if we spent 10 lessons teaching you, very subtle things that might happen once in a blue moon that will not cost you the game even when they do happen. It may sound like you're learning something much more advanced when you learn these subtle things, but actually trying to figure out why you played Queen C7 check and trying to prevent that problem in the future is going to help you a lot more than, learning some very esoteric kind of positional idea. You just get more bang for the buck from getting rid of things that really hurt you a lot. All right, so obviously after Queen C7 check, uncharacteristic of an 1800 player, Black takes the queen, white resigns, and, game over. So unfortunately, the game had to end that way, but the rest of the game is instructive, and actually that last move is instructive. We just don't know why. We can't ask White why he did that. We don't have the time stamping to guess, but it's probably either he was in great time trouble or he was overconfident and he moved too fast. Those are the two most likely things, but there's other reasons why he could make that kind of mistake as well. All right, I hopefully enjoyed today's amateur game for our YouTube channel. This is Dan Heisman. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.